Thank you again. We have had a wonderful and wonderfully productive and wonderfully enriching day covering a lot of things. And in some ways, this last panel, more like a conversation really, is the beginning of a wrap-up. Actually, it's not the beginning of a wrap-up. It's the beginning of the conversations we hope will keep happening after today. And my thought was, technically we are talking about global challenges for the 21st century, and we will. But the real intent here is to have a conversation amongst the three of us, myself, the director, and also Bill Colglazier, who we haven't heard from this morning, but now we will, who is at the Center for Science Diplomacy at AAAS, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, to have a conversation that is partly a reflection, a continuation of all the conversations we've had, but structured around this big question of the 21st century. As you've heard, I'm the founding dean of our school, the Pardee School, and when we established it, we said it was a school for the 21st century. I've stopped saying that because I've realized that about a fourth of that century is over. The time does actually fly when you're having fun. And saying that something about the 21st century is no longer necessarily about talking about the future, because at least 22% of it is now behind us. But really to start thinking or get us thinking about the longer term. In a way, there is a pattern to this. If you think about it, we started this morning and we heard from Roger these wonderful stories and wonderful narrative about being present at the creation and what it meant and why it came about and how it came about. We've heard from Albert earlier this morning about all the exciting stuff that's happening right now. And we have heard through the day from all of you in various ways about what IIASA has meant substantively as well as intellectually as well as personally to all of us here in this room. So the logical sort of next question is, whither to now? And as I was thinking about that, Albert, one thought that came to me from your earlier remarks was, because IIASA is IIASA, anything you're doing now already has embedded in it some theory of what is coming in the future. And if Jeff is to be believed, then IIASA is 10 years ahead of everyone else in thinking about what it is. So what you're working on now, people will get to in 10 years. And therefore, our question is, where will IIASA get to in 10 years? Right?
I'm not allowed to tell you.
But I want, you can take this where you want. But the conversation I really want to have is, what are those big things? Not on the horizon, but beyond the horizon. Because I'm hoping what's on the horizon we are already talking about. And the proposition embedded in how I have just phrased it is that there is a lot of dust on the other side of the horizon that we can see. We may not exactly know why that dust is there. Many of us have ideas, but all times are exciting. Sometimes are a little too exciting. And this may be one of those times, that there are some fundamental big questions, which in some ways, Roger, I would argue, makes this a more interesting and not necessarily in a good way time than when IIASA was first established. And that's what I hope in terms of what we talk about IIASA, about the world, about science, about diplomacy. What is that dust? I'll just throw out a few words, and I don't know if those are the right ones, but I know those are the ones that keep us at the Pardee School awake, and myself. Those are about the future of democracy. Those are about the future of peace. Those are about the future of science. Those are the future of collaboration. In some ways, when IIASA was created, what was taken as a given in your picture of Kosygin and Lyndon Johnson was at least a stated desire to collaborate. And I'm not sure we live in a world where that desire is even stated, let alone, and I may be sort of putting too dark a cloud on this, but what I do what I am trying to do is, I do not think I am alone in thinking that there are some big questions lingering. And if those questions are lingering, then who other than IIASA to start thinking about? And that's the conversation that I wanted to start with. So let me, with that little introduction, throw it back to you, Albert. What is in your crystal ball?
You want me to start? Okay, all right. I think we've spoken a lot today about the sustainability challenges that face us, and I think clearly this is in the ongoing research agenda, this is something that we are certainly addressing. I know some of the staff at IIASA are really concerned about the prospects for growing inequalities across the globe from a human perspective. Primarily because I think these are likely to be the sources of future social tipping points as a society. And this relates to your comments around, democracy as the best we have of all systems, if we can keep it, as they say, and I think there's significant pressures and threats that are looking at us in that space. So the idea, and to be honest, I think the growing inequalities simply foster a climate where people will grab at any populist notions that get thrown at them for improving society, even though there's no plan. Simply just to change things for no other reason. And I don't think that we've come to terms with the fact that, and we are causing that, by not addressing the inequality challenge and not tackling it directly. We are creating and fostering a climate and an environment in which populism can unseat democracy very, very easily if we get it wrong. And that's why I'm talking about social tipping points. And we need to be aware of it, that we are creating this by not addressing the issues of inequality appropriately. So I think that for us is something that when people talk to me about saving the planet, frankly, I don't think the planet gives a damn whether we are or not.
Yes.
And
it did fine before us, it will be fine after us.
It did fine before us as well. And for me, the issue here is about crafting a dignified future for humanity, one way or the other. Or are we going to succumb to a future where we're going to be forced to live like social insects, just in order to survive? And these are the choices that we have in the long term. You're talking about the dust.
And what do those choices mean for an institution like IIASA?
Well, it means that as an institution like IIASA, and this is part of the strategic plan thinking as well, that we cannot just be focusing on the biophysical elements of our planet as an institution. We have to understand the social dynamics in the social institutions, the governance issues, everything else, which I think is going to evolve and develop much more rapidly than any of the biophysical threats, as immediate as some of them, like climate change, are. I think that these social threats are sometimes, in some instances, much more imminent and much more pressing. And therefore, I think we need to pay a lot of serious, rapid attention to those. And this is one of the reasons why we've readjusted the research programs to allow us space to look at just societies as a key focus in the coming time. So for me, that balance between focusing on the biophysical, clearly we want to have a nice, good environment in which to function and operate, but we also have to make sure that we create social environments and milieus in which people can thrive, live up to their full potential, and hopefully deliver on this notion of a dignified future for all. That's going to take significant socioeconomic rethinking. We just don't have the tools to tackle that at the moment. I know that there are lots of conversations going on around about things like a universal income grant, for argument's sake, those sort of conversations that people are talking about seriously. I think these are going to become really important. I'm not saying that's the only or the right solution, but the issue is that everybody on the planet must have an opportunity to at least live and have access to the most basic resources and live a decent life. And that means that you must have some food security, you must have some water security, hopefully a roof over your head. These are things, and hopefully energy as well, that's supplied in a sustainable manner. And if you can't provide that to the vast majority of people on the planet, we are headed for trouble. And I think that's clearly so that's for me is one of the things that we're trying to focus on and say we have to strengthen our work and understanding the social economic systems together with the biophysical parameters in which we have to function into the future. So that's the one point that I wanted to make that I think IIASA is trying to focus on. The other issue is one that's more, for me, more governance linked. We found over the last couple of years, and I think this has happened repeatedly, and I think COVID and the Ukraine war are good examples of that, is that we have this urgent agenda 2030 to deliver a better world through the sustainability challenges. But what happens is that this agenda gets interrupted repeatedly. And it gets interrupted because we have a pandemic, because we have a war. We may have another war in a few years' time somewhere else. And what happens repeatedly is that this long-term agenda gets put on the back burner in order to deal with the immediate crisis that we face and we have to deal with. We need to find a way. And this is reminiscent, I think it was said this morning as well. This is reminiscent of the time when the economies of the world were struggling repeatedly. Countries were defaulting on debt. Hyperinflation was on the go just after the Second World War. There was chaos in the international economics system. There was, and it urgently required some stability in order to make progress, to make sure that trade can happen significantly, that growth could happen across the globe. And we had the Bretton Woods conversations. We created the World Bank and the IMF and under those conditions, and inserted them into the global economy. And for a long period of time, they worked very efficiently and effectively to actually grow the global economy, to stabilize the global economy, to get trade going and so on. And my thinking is that in the environment sustainability space, we need that type of intervention. I'm not saying mirror that, because that may not be appropriate in today's world anymore. But the idea is we need a vehicle that will allow us to maintain the activities and the work that needs to be done around the sustainability agenda, despite the choppy waters that we have to traverse in terms of other disruptions and other things that are happening. If this gets put on the back burner every time there's a crisis, we're never going to actually make progress. So we need to find a global governance mechanism instrument that allows us to steam ahead with that agenda despite all the other crises that we have to tackle and deal with. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have at some stage. So that is for me a second issue. I don't have a solution or an answer for that, but I think it's just the times and the analogy with what happened in the 1940s rings a bell, and somehow maybe we can learn from that. And then I think the other part of that, which I think is related to this, is the third part for me, and that is, I do think that we need to find ways of promoting inclusive cooperation and increased multilateralism around the world. We really are struggling with this. And maybe IIASA can be a catalyst for that, as we were talking about over lunchtime, one way or the other. And maybe there's a role for IIASA to play in that space. But we need to find a way. The fragmentation that's going on at the moment, unfortunately, is unfortunate. But again, I'm coming back to my first point. There's a reason why that fragmentation is happening. And yet we deny that we're responsible. We think it's other powers that are responsible. If you disenfranchise people, if people feel threatened, if they can't pay their bills, they will grasp at straws in order to change the current socioeconomic system. And we are creating that ourselves. We need to be much more progressive to help people and assist people around the world. If we don't want too many autocrats and other people to raise their heads above the parapet around the world into the future. So just some 3 thoughts from my side.
Thank you. Those are profound thoughts, and I personally am very happy with your focus on the human system, because the human system is where a lot of these challenges are becoming. These words that you have raised are actually very full of meaning: dignified futures, just world, and these are not easy words, including on the things we do. For example, like climate. In many ways, I was talking to other people this afternoon, the scientific problems of climate were always easier, and we have ever greater, better handle on it. The hurdle is not that we don't have enough science. The hurdle is the diplomacy. The hurdle is the negotiation. The hurdle is the system. But let me go to Bill and see if you have any reflections, particularly from this idea of science and diplomacy. And if I might throw the last thing that Albert talked about, multilateralism, which you were very polite to say we have problems. It seems to me it's not present. The first casualty of COVID was multilateralism. The absolute first casualty of COVID was multilateralism. Here we had an emergency test system of a global problem in this small little pandemic, small compared to what is coming, we know, for example, with climate change. And the first thing that failed was any semblance of multilateralism. My mask, my door is closed, my planes won't fly, I'm not going to give you my ventilator, I'm not going to share vaccine.
Even within countries like the US and even within organizations like the European Union, that's quite frightening.
And that goes to the trust conversation. But anyhow, I have said too much. Bill.
No, thank you. First, let me say I really enjoyed the YSSP presentations today, the long ones and the short ones from the young and the old YSSPers. They were great. And of course, Roger's talk and Albert giving an update on what's occurring at IIASA. But I would like to turn to the very near future of IIASA. Let me just tell you my background with IIASA. I'm on the U.S. National Member Organization for IIASA, but I first learned about it back when I was in the Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School at Harvard in the early 1980s. That was also in the period when the Reagan administration cut funding for IIASA, and there were a number of senior professors, Howard Raiffa was one of them at the Kennedy School, who really did the lion's work in getting foundations and others to help supply some of the funding that the United from foundations, what the U.S. government removed to enable IIASA to move forward. So that was one existential crisis for IIASA back then. I certainly want IIASA to last for another 50 years, to continue doing all the kind of great applied systems analysis that's being done now. But right now, IIASA has another existential crisis that's coming from the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Any organization that has member organizations from both the Ukraine and Russia is bound to have serious problems. And you heard a little bit from Albert about the fact that there are threats of certain countries perhaps remove their funding from IIASA, and it's all related to what extent there should be any kind of relations at all with Russia at this time. And so IIASA is going through a struggle. We're talking about the Raiffa Center, creating a negotiation center. Actually, Albert is a great negotiator, but he has his own negotiation problems right now with the members of the IIASA Council and trying to preserve his existence for the long term. So in trying to think what sort of advice I might give at this time, both for the near-term problems for IIASA as well as for the long term. But let me first of all say, take a grain of salt with my predictions about the future. I thought I would just list 5 predictions that I made in the past that turned out to be very bad predictions. So I've gotten much more humble in my old age. But I was the Science and Technology Advisor in the State Department from 2011 to 2014. One of the things we did was work a lot with intelligence agencies, trying to anticipate what were the opportunities, the challenges, threats, and disruptions from emerging science and technology. There were very smart people from many different fields, did a lot of interesting things. I thought one area that we totally underestimated the disruptive impacts was social media. So it shows you that scientists, intelligence professionals can not always be very good predictors of the future. In November of 2019, I gave a keynote address at the World Science Forum on what were the big challenges for science diplomacy looking to the future, and I listed 5 of them. And several of them that the IIASA works on now, which is, I think, is great. The one I didn't list was a pandemic. And of course, it was only just a couple of months later when the pandemic disrupted the world. But really the bad prediction that I made was I thought the US would be the best prepared country in the world to deal with the pandemic. And that turned out to be a terrible prediction for a high-income country to do such a miserable job in how it dealt with the pandemic. I was a science advisor at the, I was co-chair of a committee at the UN to advise on the role of science, technology, innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals from 2016 to 2018. And our task was really to try to make it real practical, actionable steps out of the wonderful rhetoric coming out of the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the things that we did, I championed particularly, was getting support for several developing countries to sort of produce an integrated plan to combine their national plan with their plan for what they want to achieve in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also their plans to start increasing their capacity in science, technology, and innovation. And we had 6 pilot countries supported by several international agencies, supported by several advanced countries, Japan in particular, not the United States, unfortunately. Among those 6 pilot countries, one was Ukraine and another was Ethiopia. This was in the period 2016 to 2020. And look what's happened in both countries. It shows you what war conflicts can do to disrupt the best laid plans for trying to work on sustainable development issues. So I guess the lesson that I take, also I'll give you one last prediction too, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm on the board of a nonprofit that has an office in Kiev with 45 people. None of the people at this office, all but one, were Ukrainian nationals, thought that the Russians would invade Ukraine. I also thought it was almost a 0 probability the Russians would invade, in part because we thought we were dealing with a rational actor, and the fact that the downside consequences for a Russian invasion were so bad for Russia that no reasonable rational actor would take that step, and that turned out to be a terribly bad prediction too. So I think the uniting factor in many of my bad predictions really came from underestimating the impact of politics, culture, history, values, trust, on how that can disrupt everything. Sometimes it can create opportunities, but often it can be a tremendous disruptive force and create shocks that are hard to deal with. So the lesson I take from this, I want IIASA to continue with all the fine work it does in applied systems analysis, but I think it could be helped. And I think some of this could be provided by the Pardee Center, by the Raiffa Center, if we can actually lead to its creation, is to sprinkle a few more people at IIASA who come from fields, certainly some of the social behavioral sciences, but also the political sciences, from the humanities, from history, the studies of culture, and especially practitioners, people that are actually doing this in the real world. And also in some cases with popularizers, writers. This science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, I don't know how many were familiar with this book on the Ministry of the Future, which has really kind of captivated a large audience in the United States. He started out with writing the Martian trilogy about, science fiction. He sort of says, well, I encouraged all these rich guys to go and think they wanted to go populate, other planets. But he says the real issue, the real concern is what's happening to the world right now. But he's able to actually reach a much larger audience than, I'm afraid, many of our fine studies, including from the IPCC. So I think with sprinkling a few more of these other people coming from widely different fields, and the Raiffa Center could certainly do it in the case of negotiations with practitioners involved in negotiations, Doesn't necessarily have to be from the government level, but some from the government, from State Departments, foreign ministries, but some from, as we heard in our little dialogue today, from the private sector, from local governments. They're all engaged internationally right now. The world remains still globalized to a considerable extent. So and I think there could be a benefit to IIASA, including the studies that it now does, perhaps in sort of building a bigger capacity inside IIASA in dealing with the real world practitioners and getting a message to them, at the same time helping these people that are trying to do these things in the world to actually see the benefits that come from listening to the analysis that comes from IIASA. The last thing I'll mention, that I'll quit and just say one word also in a second about multilateralism. That talk I gave in 2019 about what I thought were the 5 big issues that science diplomacy should work on. 3 of them, I think, are actually being done at IIASA. One, of course, is accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. That has certainly become a major focus. Another one was maintaining a channel of communication between estranged countries. Well, IIASA was a science diplomacy institution. Could perhaps think a little bit more about how do we maintain this channel of communication, particularly in some of the drastic events that we're dealing with now. The third was building the capacity. I said the science, technology, innovation capacity in developing and emerging economies. Already heard today about several, I think, great examples of the work that IIASA has done in development. The fourth one, I think IIASA probably can't do much, although it might think about it, they could learn from it. Controlling these new technologies of war and advancing arms control agreements. There's tremendous focus on that right now, obviously, with coming out of the threats arising from the invasion of Ukraine. And the last, I think, is actually a very fruitful area that IIASA might think about, and that's providing foresight and dialogue on the implications, both the opportunities as well as the threats and disruptions of these new emerging scientific and technological developments. Science and technology are moving incredibly fast. The things that are coming at us are just quite incredible. And they do create great opportunities, but they also create great threats. My experience at the UN was, yes, the diplomats recognize the opportunities, but they're much more worried about the threats coming out of advancing science and technology. And so having IIASA being a fountain of knowledge, a way to communicate, trying to understand these implications and what they imply, including for all of the things that IIASA studies. Just the last comment on multilateralism. Again, I think the failure that multilateralism broke down with the pandemic, for example, is for those issues that I mentioned before with, politics, culture, history, trust, all of those things. So that the more that IIASA can work to understand the implications of these other factors that affect all of your work, I think will help to promote not only what IIASA now does, but also perhaps develop new lines of aiding decision makers around the world.
Albert, any thoughts on what Bill just pointed out as these new areas, as well as these new sort of dimensions, including especially what I found intriguing was the threat of technology, which as cheerleaders we usually don't think about.
Yeah, it is targeted in our strategic plan. We've started putting in a group in the Advancing Systems Analysis program that focuses on data and new technologies. But we're still building the capacity in that group at the moment. I don't think we've had huge successes, but we're now in the space where we routinely starting to use, because we got to use these technologies before we can fully understand them. And I think, so that's the issue around machine learning and AI technologies, to get to grips with them, what they mean in the broader context of decision making at the end of the day. The social media space, of course, is something that we've really not studied, to be honest, as an institution at all. I know that there are many groups globally that are studying social media to a huge extent, and there are huge critics out there that talk about, this new emerging society of people being captured by social media companies and value being extracted out of their social personal information and all that sort of stuff. This is, I think it's a huge threat for us, but I think the problem there comes back to a point that Paul raised earlier around the table about where powers are shifting to in terms of who's running the show globally at the moment. Are national governments still running the show? Have they lost the plot, or are they losing the plot in terms of their ability to manage and run these mega organizations? And if the mega organizations have the ability to start engaging with and manipulating large chunks of the global population, then national governance and other issues may become largely immaterial if they succeed in that sort of, that sort of way. And this is not something that we at IIASA have actually come to grips with at all, to be honest. I mean, we've talked about it internally and so on, and I know people are aware of it, but it's not something that we've studied. And so that is certainly something that I think, Bill, is of real interest, because it changes the nature of, not just the nature of politics, it changes the nature of where does the power lie in a global scale, and I think, and that's interesting that even at a micro level, cities are becoming more important. There's some cities that have bigger budgets than many countries, and so this is where the power is starting to lie, is in the local level, and then at the global level. And I think nations and nationhood is kind of floating around the middle, still trying to find its feet a little bit in that space.
I do think that's very perspective, including on cities, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. But we saw that with the Paris Agreement, and sort of the US as a government might have stepped back, but a number of cities sort of stepped forward. And we all celebrated that. But you think for a little moment and you could say, okay, this can go other ways too, on different issues. And come COVID, we saw it going different ways in different issues. But Bill, on that, and I do want to press you on the science diplomacy issue. I was really intrigued when you said a minute ago that IIASA is an institution for science diplomacy. Right? And when you said that, it suddenly sort of fit into place. Where do you see science diplomacy as a question going, and where, if anywhere, in that is IIASA?
Well, I phrased that just the fact of the IIASA's creation between the U.S. government and the Soviet Union during one of the worst times of the world of the Cold War shows that it was an attempt to use at least applied systems analysis as the tool to try to maintain this dialogue between countries that were at each other's throats basically in that period. And the fact that IIASA now has Iran and Israel as members, Pakistan, India has been a member at time. It has had countries that have had significant conflicts. So just maintaining that dialogue, I think it's very useful. My concept of science diplomacy is broader than that, though. I see it as a tool or as a mechanism for trying to accomplish concrete goals. It can be knowledge from science, scientific expertise, scientific engagement, helping to advance diplomatic goals, but it can also be diplomats trying to advance scientific goals. I mean, one of the challenges for at least in the advanced countries, but now it's also true in developing countries, that the science establishments recognize science is totally globalized. If you're going to stay at the forefront or have a chance of staying at the forefront, you've got to engage with the best people in the world. But there are lots of hurdles that inhibit scientific engagement. They can be from visas, they can be from sanctions, they can be from all kinds of things. And so we need more help from the real diplomats to sometimes remove some of the hurdles that inhibit international scientific engagement. So I think science diplomacy can both achieve concrete goals in diplomacy as well as concrete goals for the scientific establishment. In terms of IIASA as a tool for science diplomacy, the fact that it engages, two countries that are at war right now and trying to think about how you can use at least the fact that they have to sit around the table together, perhaps sometime in the future at a council meeting. Are there ways that just maintaining the dialogue can be fruitful? We've got, Russia's going to have a tremendous impact on the Arctic. It's already having a tremendous impact right now on world food supplies. It's going to have a big impact on climate change. Those are certainly going to have to be issues, certainly that the West and Russia have to talk about in the future. Of course, a lot of this depends on what's going to happen over the next 6 months with the war. And it's very hard. It's almost impossible sometimes to predict that. But we do know that eventually there will be an end to this war. And there will be a need about talking about all these other issues. And I think IIASA is one of the important venues for doing that. So I just want to make sure we don't lose IIASA in this crisis that we have right now, that we have it existing so we can tackle these things in the longer run.
I want to open it up in just a minute, because I'm sure people here have a lot of insight to add to this conversation with us. But one thought, as you said, I hope there is an end to this war, but there won't be an end to war. All my life, there has been a war either in the country I was living in, mostly this one, or within miles of where I was living. So Ukraine is not the first war we've seen. It is not going to be the last. I'm from Pakistan, lived right next to Afghanistan, and everyone who could has been messing with them. First it was the Soviets, and then it was the Taliban, and then it was us, and now it's the Taliban again. And all through that, Pakistan did its own meddling and so on and so forth. But the point I want to, two propositions, and comment as or if you wish. One, this proposition, sitting where I sit in my day job, that scientific collaboration, which is one of our defining features, is itself under threat around the world. Now, I'll give you a very real example. I have to sign around this time of the year every day about 5 or 6 applications for visas for researchers from different countries. And that game has totally changed. And it wasn't just a Trump effect. The O1s and the H1s world is different. And that's not just here, that's in China, that's in Russia, that's in India. In Ukraine, amongst the war images, are images of Ukraine has a very large university population of international students. And apart from wheat prices, what has happened there? And in that, I raised this because if scientific collaboration is one of the defining features of what we are talking about, then maybe that's something to think about. The second proposition related, and Albert, this is mostly for you. As I sat here today, it seemed to me we were talking about 2 institutions, not contradictory, but there were 2 different types of conversations that we reported about IIASA. A lot of those conversations were about, and in the YSSP round, both of them came, and different people were doing 2 different conversations. One conversation seemed to be, if someone came from another planet, about a research institution that was doing cutting edge research. And the second set of conversations, including Rogers in the morning, was about an international organization. Those are not contradictory. Right? The research organization, good research on climate, things that we all do, we could do in multiple places. The conversations we had as IIASA, as an international organization, I look at the world and say, okay, there are very few candidates who can do that. And it seems to me that the institutional challenge ought to be how to arrive at excellence at both, which makes life very difficult for you. But any thoughts on that? Because that universe, once you put both of these things together, a research institution of excellence and an international organization, that set is a very small group. And I'm not even sure who else is there, but very few. Any thoughts on that challenge as you look to past the horizon?
I think that's been the view that we've tried to spread in response to the war in Ukraine, is to bring to people's attention that IIASA, essentially, as I understand it, if you read the charter and everything else around what's been done for the last 50 years, is that the institution simply has a dual mandate. The one is to be a research institution of international excellence, and we have to do that because that defines your reputation as an institution at the end of the day. But we're also in the business of building bridges between communities. And we call it track 2 diplomacy. We can, depending on who you believe, you can call it whatever you like. But the idea is that we use research, as indicated in the charter, the piece that I put up this morning, to create a climate of cooperation and between peoples, whatever the situation may be, where cooperation may be difficult. So we build bridges between those communities, and we start a conversation and hopefully facilitate further conversations into the future. And I think IIASA has always tried to do that, and that is why we have the strange membership that we have. This is why at the moment when we're talking about membership, we're talking to people in Pakistan at the moment, because we think we have India on board. We need Pakistan should be part of the conversation. We also talk, we've got Israel and Egypt, but we're also talking to Jordan. I think Jordan is a very important role player in that part of the world. So we are trying to do, Ukraine and Russia is on board, and we're trying to focus in areas where it's easy just to get new members. But we're trying to focus in areas where I think the role of IIASA can be a positive influence on the development of societies. So that's one thing that we do. We're not really an international organization in the same sense that you mentioned it, but I think it's just good to remind us. We don't have government sitting around the table. We have our NMOs, as was explained this morning very clearly, which is a disadvantage in some sense, because at international organizations, you can't just kick people out. You can call each other names across the table and so on and everything else, and get cross at each other, but you can't just kick people out. But in our context, where we don't have governments, people are sort of thinking that they can. I don't think it's appropriate either in that space. But the reality is for IIASA, if we lose our ability to play the science diplomacy role that we have played historically, then we will become just another research institution. And I think that will be a major loss, not just for the institution.
It will make you far less interesting. Maybe excellent, but less interesting.
But less interesting, we'll just be another PIC or another institution that's doing systems-like analysis at the end of the day. And I think that would be a huge step backwards for the institution.
Bill, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a quick comment, just a story on showing the importance of, I think IIASA is an excellent research institution, and I think it's also doing excellent work in kind of the science diplomacy track 2 part of it. But the importance of being an excellent research institution, just an illustration. NMOs a country can be in IIASA, then it can leave IIASA. One of the cases not too long ago was the UK, the United Kingdom, left IIASA. And the scientific community in the UK was trying to put pressure on the UK government to perhaps come back into IIASA, and they were getting no traction at all. And it turned out, because I was in the government, the US government at the time, sitting next to the minister from the UK, and I said, well, do you know about IIASA? And he said, no, don't really know about it. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And so I talked to him, for about 5 or 10 minutes over there. And he said, well, that is kind of interesting. I'll go back and I'll ask and I'll try to find out what's going on. Actually, that led to the UK scientists actually getting traction in government action. Yeah, but the key thing for them, though, in making the decision whether or not to come back into IIASA was to send a group that went and did an assessment of the work at IIASA. And the group, very excellent people on that group that went there, they came back and said, it's superb work that's being done at IIASA, and the UK should rejoin. So I think that is an essential element of IIASA, maintaining that excellence.
Let me, with your permission, open it up and seek the wisdom of the room. Comments, questions, venting? Anyone? That is fine.
Since you gave permission to vent, and this is a question really.
It's the evening, why not?
We've heard about the crumbling human institutions, the governance issues that are really plaguing us that we need to look at in the future. And we know, I think, in this entire space of sustainability and particularly the energy transformation, there's been a lot more focus on technology and biophysical systems than on social sciences. And I think this is a problem that's larger than just IIASA. Last year I testified in a House subcommittee on the future of DOE's research agenda, and I was 1 out of 10 scientists, and I was the only one pushing for social science. Everyone else was focusing technology and natural science. So I'm just wondering, what has been the experience of trying to foster more social science research and grow that, and what's the prospect for the future, supporting it with funding, even at the level of federal governments or NMOs and IIASA.
Can I take a few and collect those and add to that also the humanities? Other comments, questions, thoughts? If not, Paul, I will call on you randomly. Because I can see you thinking. We have a question at the back.
Yeah, just to toss another question into the mix. You briefly talked about the way in which multinational corporations and technology, and therefore the big technology companies, are playing an increasing role in shaping our planet, both directly and indirectly. And I just wanted to hear more on whether, does that mean that they, in addition to nations, should have kind of a seat or some form of representation or engagement as, voices in IIASA? Would that improve that process in the same way that IIASA was making a bridge before between nations that wouldn't talk to each other? Or is it better, is that not a good analogy, and it's better to keep it in a national orientation?
We'll take one more. Pablo.
Thank you. Today, when we're hearing from our online visitor, near the end, he made a remark about the joy of IIASA, and we exchanged glances with Judy, and there was something there that was very potent. I do remember very vividly as a YSSPer that there was something in the air that was truly the joy of a blend of intellectual pursuit with some kind of human-centric discovery, which I found very unique given the caliber of many things. I really fear that in a time where it's not just the pandemic, it's that we have to stop traveling so much by plane. We just cannot keep claiming that climate is a problem and then fly across the planet to talk how problematic it is. That we will need to find new modalities of interaction that are often mediated by technology, Zoom and so on, which are removing the joy. And often we design things as if intentionally we're removing the joy. My question for those of you at the big table is, do you sense a role of enjoyment of work in the quality of the work and the impact of the work? And B, can we do something to bring back that joyful flavor to a post-pandemic but still heavily virtual IIASA?
Excellent. Role of social sciences / humanities, private sector, and the creation of joyfulness.
It's a happy note to end on. Okay, all right. Thank you very much for those questions. From my side, at least, the social sciences, humanities issue, what we're trying to do is not to establish them as a separate part of the institution, that complements the biophysical tradition that we have at IIASA. Our approach is to try and integrate the social sciences and humanities in all projects. So particularly when we launch internal calls like the strategic initiatives and other things, we specify that issues of inequality need to be tackled, issues of just societies need to be tackled, whether it's an energy project or a climate project or whatever, these things need to be on the table. So we try and integrate them in the projects continuously. And frankly, I think our biggest successes in terms of recent grants that we've achieved at the institutional level is where we do that effectively, so that we really can show that we're not just looking at land use conversion, but what does it mean for the people, and how do we tackle it, and what are the consequences at the end of the day, so that we try and integrate them. I think that way we make much more progress rather than trying to establish a parallel sort of stream. The Just Societies research group within the Population and Just Societies that's led up by Thomas Schinko, his mandate is within the institution to integrate and engage with all the other research groups and programs across the IIASA. It's not about just doing their own thing on their own. So their mandate is a cross-cutting mandate that they have to deliver at the end of the day. We feel that works better. Time will tell whether we're right or not, but I think at this stage, that's what we've done. I think people underestimate the urgency with, or the rate at which these things can happen. And I always remind them about Greta Thunberg and how quickly she changed the politics in Europe around climate. With the Friday movement, very, very quickly, and it had huge impact politically. So, you know, it can happen very, very quickly, and then you have to deal with it. Representation of the big corporates. This has been a conversation in council. I was chatting to Paul about this earlier. Again, it's one of the tradition, of course, is that you have these NMOs that represent the scientific communities from within a particular country. There's a very valid question, and we've asked this question, and we're having this conversation as to whether we should have alternative configurations of role players that should be part of the council of IIASA. Council has approved one configuration, which we've tried to push for, which was what we call a regional membership. And the idea is that a regional membership can be applied for by a consortium of countries that are unlikely to be able to afford membership by themselves. In other words, areas where IIASA is underrepresented, like Central America or Southern Africa or whatever the case may be, so that we have a consortium of members. You still only have one member sitting on council that represents the entire consortium, but that has now been approved by council, that they're prepared to go that route. So that's one thing that's opened up. The other question about private sector, people sitting there, about Paul was raising earlier in our conversation, what about mega cities? Why can't they apply to become a member of IIASA in that context? These conversations have been had, but frankly, there's no traction in council for those kinds of conversations at the moment. But, you know, worst comes to the worst, and there's a financial crisis. I don't know which direction that conversation is going to go there. Sometimes adversity drives things in a strange direction. The joy issue. We felt this really seriously at IIASA over the 2 years of COVID when we were under lockdown. I think it was a real loss for us, and the fact that we couldn't have the YSSPs and the normal summer program of engagement. It's just something at IIASA that happens, you know, which is really, really important. We lost out for 2 years on that, and we're hoping to regain that this year. I think there's a lot of plans in place to try and pull that back and make sure that we have the social engagements which we so treasure at IIASA, because it is an experience for everybody. In terms of travel restrictions, we've also issued some travel restrictions. I think we're trying to prevent people from traveling across the world for 1 or 2 day meetings. You know, I think that's what we're trying to prevent. I think we're trying to say to people, yes, if it's really necessary, make a case. But I think we're going to go back to traveling the way that my father them used to travel. So if you go somewhere, you go there for a month, and not just for 2 days and come back again. Go there and spend some time there and do it properly. And then the COVID issues and so on is better, easier to deal with. And the travel plans will be different. I don't think we're going to whiz around the world the way that we used to. Frankly, I'm not sure that anybody wants to. If you're really honest about it, I think that was a rather strange way of living. Let's rather go to IIASA for the summer month or a month in summer, or let's go to Australia if that's where you want to go and go work with people, spend some time there. I think that sort of engagement is going to be always there, and I don't think it's going to disappear. But I think the whizzing around is going to be terminated to some degree, and I'm not sure that was joyous anyway. But I think that we can retain some enough of the joy if we just rethink the way we do things.
Just 2 comments on the joy issue. I think that's been demonstrated clearly by the YSSPers. The fact that every one of you talked about the fun of being at IIASA, but also about the impact that it had on your subsequent careers. It was really career changing in many cases. So my suggestion is, unfortunately, take money, but expand the YSSP program. Have it so that some of the people can come actually during the rest of the year. When I was at the National Academies, we created it for my boss at the time, Bruce Alberts, with some of his proceeds from a major seller, his biochemistry textbook, to create a program called the Mirzayan Fellowships, which brought young postdocs and young graduate students to go and spend 2 months working on one of the projects at the national academies. That was also career changing, the experience that they got working at that interface of science and public policy. And for anyone, at least of my age, where you get energized is when you're interacting and working with young people again in the early part of their career. So expand things like the YSSP as much as possible. You will affect future careers. That may be one of the greatest legacies that comes from IIASA. With the private sector, trying to think of this, just I have stuff in my head. With the U.S. NMOs, particularly from the advanced countries, they all have good contacts with a number of the big multinational corporations. Let them ask one or two of those, would you be willing to at least to come and be kind of a friend of our NMO and interacting with IIASA, and have a periodic meeting where you brought these representatives of these big multinationals to come to Vienna and learn a little bit more about what IIASA is doing. So put the heavy lifting on the NMOs from the US, Europe, Japan, and others to make contacts with the multinationals in their countries and see if they can engage and link them to what IIASA is doing.
Thank you for that. We'll have at least one more round, so if people have questions. But if I can also take a crack, Pablo, at your question, because it's a non-trivial issue. And I'm not sure it's just COVID. Like many things that COVID did, it just unleashed a much larger issue that was already simmering, and COVID just sort of took the lid off it. And it's interesting you use the word joy, but in a way, I think, and this is, I say this as an educator, and I think IIASA is in the education business, certainly with YSSP. So this is an education point, at least I'm framing it as such. Somehow we've all given ourselves permission to be victims. And as someone who works on development and poverty in the South, that worries me, because if I am focused on my victimhood, I'm not focused on a lot of other injustice in the world. Because now I can put all that energy into my own anger. And therefore, anger replaces passion. And joy, I think, comes from passion. This is something that every university in this country certainly is struggling with. That the joy comes out of the inquiry, joy comes out of passion, joy comes out of discovering something that you didn't even know. The joy comes from walking the corridor and finding Tom Schelling sitting there staring at the ceiling. And you look up. This actually used to happen the year I was there, and I would wonder what is in the ceiling that he keeps staring at. Right? But this is Tom Schelling. And you can go to the Schloss restaurant afterwards as YSSP and talk to Tom Schelling. He still won't tell you what he was staring at, but he'll tell you why everything you think is wrong. But that's where the joy comes from. I say this not facetiously. Right? The joy is, in this case, is the joy of inquiry. And I do think as educators, we have to find a way to rediscover or allow people to rediscover that. I don't know how, but I do think it is important. Another round of questions. Yes.
Well, thanks. This is just a comment rather than a question, or a couple of comments. One, I think I'd love to see IIASA put as much emphasis or more emphasis on being an international organization, because it's so needed right now, and it's a unique role that you can play. Other folks can do the research, and they can't do it as well as IIASA, and they haven't. But in this day and age, IIASA has a unique place that it can fill, and I think it really ought to be focusing on that and expanding the definition of your programs to include why wouldn't you have multinationals sponsoring your conferences or your research? You just should do that. There should be, as I said, I'm the only non-PhD in here, and that's, you should have journalists involved, you should have business people involved, you should have nonprofit leaders involved. I just think we got to be thinking out of the box. But you have a basis to really make incredible change. You already have. And so, but we're in a unique time right now. And so I think we really got to be thinking out of the box.
So I'd like to echo some of the comments around the greater involvement of multinationals coming from the business school. I think you would perhaps expect that from me, also because I think multinationals play an important role and can serve as institutional intermediaries. Also, I think the role of public-private partnerships in addressing some of these sustainable development issues that we've been talking about just cannot be overemphasized, and they're not perfect. So I think there is work to be done there. But I also have a different comment which relates to, I think, what Bill and what Albert have said earlier, which is that we have a very large and rich pool of YSS peers. And I wonder what the institutional mechanisms are at IIASA to continue to engage the YSS peers. I think some of us here in this room are lucky enough to be engaged continually, and we are able to play a role in one form or the other. But I think it would be nice to have an institutional mechanism of some sort. I think we at the last committee meeting we talked about perhaps a OSSP, old scientists, or at least middle-aged scientists summer program, so people like me can continue to go back and learn about what's going on at IIASA and also contribute in terms of what we've learned and our research, or have some kind of a seminar series or conference which can periodically bring back some of the researchers, and it'll be just fun to know how people's journeys have evolved over 20, 30, 40 years. So I hope some of that can happen at IIASA.
We'll take one more. Though the reason I keep engaged with YSSP is that's the only remaining place where I'm called young. That Y is the last bastion of my youth.
You take the pension benefit, but you want to be called young.
Right. I am happy to fool myself always. One more, if anyone? Paul.
I just wanted to follow up in the comments that Albert made about thinking beyond national and international. And if the challenge is to think on a global scale and to solve real world problems, when we had the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, we evolved nations, they bumped into each other, we created international. In the 21st century, we have subnational. The cities, as you mentioned, state California is the 5th largest economy on earth. I mean, the reality is there's a spectrum of jurisdictions, and if we're to be inclusive, the nation is the central jurisdictional unit, the kilometer is the international, and the centimeter is the subnational. That's everybody on earth. And if we think into the future, I mean, somehow the challenge is to operate across this entire jurisdictional spectrum with intuition. How do we do this? I mean, I can see fundamental questions about, how we have an international legal system where the international court only hears cases from nations, for example. So there has to be an evolution somewhere in this process of how to operate on a planetary scale. I mean, the distribution systems that nations have rely on subnational. So somewhere in this mix, this intuition about how to operate into the future, I mean, in a practical sense, includes a spectrum of jurisdictions. The nation is the central jurisdictional unit. I think the nations are probably concerned about being displaced in terms of their position. But the reality is we have international because nations bumped into themselves. And today we have subnational just because there's so many of us on Earth, and the science and technology is an egalitarian approach in a sense.
Thank you. Thank you. So about operating across jurisdictions involving business again, keeping the alumni engaged, some of those things.
I'm going to ask Monica to respond to the alumni issues, just to tell everybody what's going on, because I think she's the best person in the room to talk to that. About multinationals, just so that everybody's up to speed, IIASA research engages with many multinationals. We work very closely with organizations like Google, Microsoft, SAS, large players in the insurance industry involved in our risk assessment and analysis stuff. They actually sponsor our research. So there's a lot of engagement, including some OPEC partners in the past looking at energy transitions and everything. So there's a lot of engagement around multinationals. What we don't have is a form of representation, a formal representation as far as that's concerned. And I think that's the question that I heard today. And I will certainly take that back into the conversation and see how people respond to that. The second point, or third one about jurisdiction, just to come back to that, Paul, if I may, I think your point is very valid. But I think this is a conversation we will have to have with council. I will certainly raise it with them and see what kind of response we get. But I think it's good to start that conversation. It may take a while to find traction or even only pieces of it. But the point is, it's a conversation that we should have about the future of the institution and how do we position ourselves to operate most effectively. There is a danger that if you go too far down that road of being inclusive in terms of jurisdictions, that you will kind of lose your international status as an institution. So one has to just think about that as well. There's a trade-off there that we have to deal with. But that's a valid point. Monica, are you ready to go and tell everybody about what's happening at IIASA Connect?
Yeah, so we're bringing together a global systems analysis community on a platform we've called IIASA Connect. And we've launched 2 event series on there. We really want to bring people together to talk about their research, about achievements, about opportunities, about topics that span across different research areas. And I think COVID, we talked a lot about COVID and the pandemic, but one thing that it's allowed us is everybody is more comfortable with these virtual spaces. And so we're connecting people in a safe space to have conversations and engage. Not at like we don't want to have everybody zoomed out, but to start that and then see where those can go. So if somebody wants to engage more with IIASA, we have a series called IIASA Connect Features, and it's a 30-minute conversation where the whole network is invited to come. So that's our staff, it's our alumni, it's our former YSSPers, our NMO communities, so also everybody here. There's a United States group. We have these groups also with events, and everybody's invited to join us. I think Maggie will also follow up with more there. So that's what we're doing.
I think the issue is that many of our research groups, and I think this is the other point that she didn't mention now, is that are using IIASA Connect as a platform to engage with the research communities that they work with. So they even have online workshops, they have online discussions around research topics, the development of proposals, joint proposals. All these things are happening on IIASA Connect. It's a social media platform, but it's in-house. So it's only for the people that are part of IIASA. It doesn't go anywhere beyond that. And so it really, through the COVID pandemic, we've created a platform that has really opened up our engagements with many of our NMOs. And it'll allow you guys to communicate amongst yourselves as you want to keep tabs on each other. We can set up seminars. We set up regular presentations from our research group leaders, from our program directors. Myself and Lena have done seminars online to everybody around on that platform. So I would really encourage people to log into that platform and become part of that community. You're so much closer to IIASA there than you would be in any other way that we can envisage at this point in time.
Very good. Bill?
I just want to turn it back briefly to the proposal for a Raiffa Center. I think it would certainly be great to bring in, not to create a new division at IIASA, but to bring in some expertise in negotiations at all levels that can actually benefit all the other parts of IIASA in their work. But the idea in listening to a number of the good ideas that came here that might benefit IIASA in the future, the Raiffa Center could actually be something larger. It could actually be a venue for bringing in other expertise for visits that also could benefit all parts of IIASA, whether it's journalists and writers or people from business, whether it's bringing in more people from the humanities, in culture studies, political scientists, again, to use it as a way to kind of enlarge the dialogue with all parts of IIASA and in between the different divisions of IIASA, but bringing in expertise that might benefit them all. So I think the Raiffa Center is a great idea, but you might think about how the idea could be expanded in encompassing a number of things in addition to having a primary focus on negotiation expertise.
Can I mention something else?
Sure.
That you raised about your old scholars initiative. We've been struggling with this for a while. It's been an ongoing conversation between friends of IIASA and even the NMO and IIASA. Let me just be frank about this issue so that everybody understands it. We're struggling to employ senior researchers from the US at IIASA. The reason for that is quite simply that we're a tax-free institution. We don't pay tax, none of the staff do. So therefore the salaries have been benchmarked because people don't pay tax. All right, and this is cheaper for everybody because the NMOs can employ many more people with a bit of money they put on the table and so on. So it's a cost-efficient way of doing it. Otherwise, this is a benefit we got from the Austrian government. And so if you don't do it that way, you just have to put in more money and get tax back. It's just a circular sort of argument. And the consequence for US senior scholars is that if you earn more than $100,000, which is the cutoff that the US Congress has put in place, and then you do have to pay tax in the US. So irrespective of whether you get your money tax-free in Austria, you would have to pay tax on that money here in the US. That would mean for us to employ very senior US scholars, we would have to pay them a lot more than we pay the rest of the people at IIASA, so to compensate for the tax difference. That's going to create HR issues for me internally in the institution, and you don't want to know about that. I have to deal with Austrian labor law. You're lucky you don't have to. Okay, but this is the reality. So we're trying to think about mechanisms about how we can get people to come spend sabbaticals or other time that they may get from the US institutions, even if it's research time at IIASA. We could partially compensate the institution for your time there to get a substitute or whatever you think may be required to carry the difference. It won't be at the same level as your salary, which you'll keep earning while you're in Austria, but it'll allow us to give the institution a partial compensation for the time that you spend there. I'm trying to think about these mechanisms all the time. So if there's anybody that has and would like to spend some time at IIASA, would like to explore these mechanisms and see how we can use them, then I would like to explore that, because I think if we can have a few examples of this working, it'll help us a lot to open up that landscape. It's just an alternative way of trying to deal with this. So keep it in mind, and if you think your president of your university or your dean is going to be amenable to this kind of arrangement, then
Deans are mean.
Speak to Adil. I know some of them. I know that. Oh, I was one.
Since I don't want to end this panel on the note of Austrian labor law, allow me to ask one quick question of both of you, and allow me to be silly. It is late in the day, so allow me to be silly. Imagine it's 2032, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary, and you're welcome to come back to Boston University. We'll give you a better room that time. What do you think? And this is partly so that all of us have predictions that we were wrong on. What do you think those of us in this room would be most surprised by that might happen in the next 10 years in terms of IIASA?
Well, this one you can take first.
He has more experience at wrong predictions, I guess.
You're good at this. Come.
So because so many of my predictions are wrong, I should make the prediction that I hope IIASA disappears. That will ensure that it makes it to 2032. I guess it'll surprise me a little bit, but not all that much, and I hope it comes to pass. I mean, of course, when I got involved in the UN 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, my hope, of course, was I could last to 2030 and see how well we achieved those goals. I still think it's going to be a very heavy lift, and they're already thinking now what's going to follow on from after. What's the next big UN initiative that goes for another decade or more? But it would be great, I think. I was a big fan of the World in 2050 project, which is one of the initiatives the IIASA ran for several years that I think did have an impact on a number of the diplomats and countries involved dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I guess my prediction I would like is some of IIASA's work is shown to have a real benefit and in countries are marshaled to do, in particular, just the issue of how if you deal with all of these different issues, rather than have a policy just to deal with energy and one to deal with climate, one to deal with water, if you find out where the synergies can actually interact beneficially and make it a whole lot cheaper and effective for countries to mobilize their policy measures to accomplish the multiple goals at the same time. That was one of the aspirational goals of the SDGs. Look at all the synergies, reduce the conflicts, and try to maximize almost at the most efficient cost to achieve these 17 goals across the waterfront. So I'll be a little surprised if it happens. I'm hoping around to see whether I'm surprised or not, but I'm really glad that IIASA is continuing to work on all of these issues.
So we've got license to be silly. Yeah?
And yes,
Okay,
yes, and
right.
nothing you say will be held against you.
But yet be serious. I'm not going to talk about the science. I think Bill has covered that. But I think one wish I would have, is if we come back here in 10 years' time, is that there's a female director sitting in this chair talking to you. I think it will be a very huge step forward for the institution. So I hope we can get that done.
Yeah, much earlier than the 10 years.
Much even, hopefully should be towards the end of a tenure by that stage. So I think that would be a wonderful step forward. The other thing that where it should be 10 years from now, I hope that the issue around multilateralism and the dangers that we see and we've been talking about all day, we're at that stage we a shadow in the past, and we've managed to conquer that particular space. I think that is going to be a major enabler for an institution like IIASA to move forward and really excel if we can deal with that problem that we foresee.
If I can add mine, which is actually quite similar to yours, I actually even hope that the IIASA will look much more like the IIASA that was in terms of bridge building. That would have become much more of a goal and priority, not as much because of what happens inside IIASA, but what will be happening around the world. And the need for that will become more. On those and whatever other wishes you have, which you can submit to Monica on Connect to continue the conversation. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful conversation. I'm going to pass on. Please join me in thanking both of them for being such good sports, and my apologies.